Anyway, yeah, lovely to see everyone here. And obviously, I know there's being recorded as well. So hi to people watching later on online. So yes, thanks, Sophie. My name's Gillian. I live in Falmouth, so I'm, pretty local, kind of. And as Sophie said, we met many years ago, and when we were training with an outdoor fitness group called Fitness World. So our sort of like paths have crossed quite a bit in different ways. And yeah, I guess I ended up with this really amazing title. I always think like when charities get patrons, it's usually like royalty, but you got me. But I guess it's because of my work as a TV presenter on BBC. I do wildlife stuff. I've worked in wildlife natural history filmmaking. I keep saying 20 years, but I've got to roll that clock on. It's almost 30 years now. And hence the old photo. And I guess in many ways, I always find it really surprising when people come to me and ask me to do things like this, like be a patron of my charity. Will you give us a talk? Will you tell us about your career? 'Cause I'm like, really, me? Because I don't feel like I have, I feel like I've muddled through life basically a lot. And I feel like I've made a series of probably what I call happy accidents and some bad decisions as well. A lot of bad decisions, actually. We'll talk about that some other time. So anyway, so I always find it really surprising. Like, okay, well, what will I talk about? And I was going to tell it, spend quite a lot of time talking about, well, how I did what I did, my career. But I'm going to race through that because I've realized that I was the only person, I think, in the room that didn't put my hand up at all when Kirsty was asking who uses social media, who's, does X, Y, and Z. And I'm going to guess that most people watching as well online, might also sort of have put their hands up or thought, yeah, I do that. So I came to this thinking, well, it's going to be about social media. I'm not sure what I can say because I don't really use social media. But actually, turns out I have a lot to say. So I'm going to race through a few of the slides just because that will help you to understand, I guess, okay, let me reframe that. I'm going to talk about my career in the context of I now have a career that is a very public-facing career, sort of on national telly and all that kind of stuff, but I don't use social media. And when I quit social media, I thought, well, a lot of people told me that's the end. You will not be able to do this job without social media. I absolutely had to quit social media. I had a real problem with it. For all the reasons that Kirsty said. I won't even go into all of that. But there was no question in my mind that I needed to stop, and I did for a month. And that was back in July 2021. And I remember exactly where I was. I was on a walk near Kynance Cove, and I was on my own, having just supposedly the Sunday of being sort of out in nature and doing all the stuff I love. And I literally, every step I took, I was thinking about, oh, this would be a good post. Oh, I could say this. And I'd found that I'd gotten to this point in my head where I was constantly thinking about what I could post on social media. And I never had a break from social media. Even if my phone wasn't with me, I didn't have a break. So it was in my head. So that's when I quit. And I thought I was only going to quit for a month. And a month turned into almost 3 years. And the timing of this is quite interesting because yesterday, I started a new podcast. It went live at 5 a.m. yesterday. So it's on Spotify and Apple. It's called If I Rule the World. And I thought, and I've got sponsors, really great sponsors, really generous sponsors. And I thought, I've got to plug this. I've really got to push this out there because, we've got to make this work now for the sponsors. And for me, and for the guests, and for all the reasons I've done the podcast. So I went on Instagram last night, my first Instagram post since July 2021, and within about half an hour, I was scrolling. I didn't get to sleep till 1 o'clock in the morning because I couldn't stop scrolling. And it's really bad. I probably not, maybe I'm a particularly bad user, but but anyway, so I'm going to talk a lot about how I don't use social media and how I managed this career up until last night. So anyway, this is little me. This is me back in Kenya where I was born. I like to start my talks with this because it actually helps me connect with who, I think I am. And who that girl was. And also it's an indicator as well of how old I am. So I am old enough to have reached adult life and operated through most of my 20s without the internet, without devices, without social media. So I'm here to tell you it's possible. I'm here to tell you, if you don't believe me, watch any like sitcom, Friends or whatever, and that was what life was like before all of this, and it was actually okay. So that was little me. Okay, so I'm going to try and race through this. So I was born in Kenya. I basically played outdoors a lot. It wasn't even like I found nature. It was just part of my life. My mom worked for the UN, and this is it was a very similar poster, not this one, but this was kind of one of the earliest things I remember when I got switched on to the idea that, oh, hang on, the world has a lot of like problems and there are things we got to fix. And obviously growing up in a country like Kenya, it wasn't just environmental, it was social as well. Like, it was obvious like from the get-go that, not everyone had things easy, and not everyone, like, life wasn't fair, basically, is probably the quickest way to say that. So my environmentalism was switched on by this idea of water scarcity. And I remember this poster in my mom's office when she worked in the UN. So that was that sparked my journey, was where I was born. Sorry, that's really grim. I realize I do these talks with people who are really into natural history, and I'm like, oh my gosh. Anyway, that's what I spent a lot of time staring at by the time I got to university. I did a whole I did biology. My specialism was insects, hence the slide. And at the time I was thinking, well, I'll do something that's going to get me a job. And I thought, well, the practical thing to do would be like figure out how to kill lots of insects, because that's what people pay people to do. So I actually did the opposite of what I do now. I studied livestock pest management. So that's why I stared at flies a lot. And then I decided that wasn't a great job. So I did a big handbrake turn and decided, I went to Bristol University, and that's where BBC make all their wildlife programs. And that was the first series I worked on. I thought, because I was a Kenyan, that I would, and I speak Swahili and I had the Kenyan passport, I was like, and they do loads of filming in Kenya. I was like, well, that's the obvious place they're going to send me. They're going to send me to Kenya to, help them make films. But I've never, to this date, made a film in Kenya. So there you go. So that was the first thing I worked on, which was a series about European wildlife, but that's because I spoke a few languages, so that's why. I then went on and embraced my entomology and insects. So I worked on this IMAX film called Bugs. Then I worked as a producer and director on, and researcher, actually, I did the whole thing. Not just me, what I mean is I worked through the ranks as I worked on this series with a South African herpetologist. That was really like popular stuff when I started my career, making films about scary things that scared the shit out of everyone, basically. And they were like, yeah, we like that. So it was the opposite of Attenborough, basically. And yeah, I got to work with some pretty cool things. Again, this is the sort of thing that if I was doing this talk for natural history, people would be like, oh, cool, king cobra. They are very cool snakes. But if you don't like snakes, I'm sorry, so move on. And then, whoa, needle cross the record. I know I did biology, I should have known this, but anyway, I got pregnant. and that sort of like changed everything, because I was on this like career path and trundling along. And then that was about a few weeks before my son was born. And I took that photo, not ever thinking I'd use it in a talk, but because at the time I was having a little bit of a kind of like panic attack, I guess, about like, oh my God, I'm going to become a mum. So I took this photo because it was the first time I'd washed all his clothes. I didn't know he was going to be a he. I'd washed all this stuff and hung it on a line and thought, holy crap, it's real, like I'm going to be a mum. And I didn't know at the time as well that it was like life would never be the same again. And I'd already enrolled him into a nursery, childcare place before he was born. And when he was born, I was like, I can't do the job I do. I'm going to have to find something else, because, I was, oh my gosh, I'm feeling emotional. I was a very, I didn't want to leave him, basically. I was a very dedicated, no, I'm not dedicated. Maybe I was like an overly attached mom. Maybe that's the other way of looking at it. But anyway, it changed everything, becoming a mom. I was a stay-at-home mom for way longer than I ever thought I'd be. I ended up not going back into any kind of work until my son was about 7. And it was not an easy time, but anyway, you know, I'm really glad I did it. And I always chuck that into talks as well, because I think it's like, it's sort of like one of those things we never talk about, like how your life changes when you become a parent. And it's not just mums, obviously dads too. So anyway, and then ta-da! There was me with my co-presenters. So what happened is, by the time I started presenting on BBC Springwatch, I had gone through becoming a mom. I had gotten divorced, very painful, messy divorce. And I was now, by this point, in Cornwall, really far away from the people I knew that I could network and get work with. So, you know, any prospect of working in Cornwall felt like a very far away. My family were all in Kenya, so I was very isolated here. And I took this chance with doing voiceover work, which led to presenting, and it very quickly, I mean, if I tried to plan this career trajectory, it would never have worked out. So like I said, happy accidents. And then I'm like presenting on BBC Springwatch, and all of a sudden I go from being someone who always perceived her work as behind the camera and producing and directing to being in front of the camera, and then realizing, okay, well, I have a voice. What am I going to say? What am I going to do with it? And it's taken a really long time, up until yesterday when the podcast went live, to finally create this space for myself where I feel like I hope, well, we'll see how the podcast goes, but the intention is that that's the place where I get to explore ideas and explore stories and concepts and values and all that stuff in the way that makes sense to me and the way that I hope is uniquely me. So I'm going to stop with the slides there, because this is where I go off track. Got 10 more minutes? Yeah. No, 5, isn't it? No, 10. 10. Okay. Phew, slow down, Gillian. Okay. So, so this is where I was going to go on and talk about other stuff, but I'm not going to, because I feel like the social media thing is obviously why we're here. And having thought I had nothing really to bring to it, I thought I would give you an idea of what it's like and has been like for the last 2 years. Actually, I'm going to give you the idea of what social media meant for me from this point forward. So when I joined this production, how many of you have watched Springwatch, by the way? Oh, wow, God, more than I expected. Whoa, okay. Okay, I'll be careful what I say then. It wasn't an easy start for me, because I basically, like I said, was doing voiceover work, and I love talking, as you might have told, but I didn't want to be seen, and I don't know why. I mean, I literally haven't even thought about that, but I knew that I was very happy in a voice recording booth, in the dark with a little light and headphones on, a little microphone, and I loved that sort of stage. You know, for me, that was like the perfect stage. Like, no one could see me, they could just hear me. So I thought about radio presenting, all that kind of stuff, and then all of a sudden I was very visible. And initially it started off really well, because I was like, oh, I'll just do a few guest presenting bits and I'll just kind of talk about the things that really excite me. So I got to talk about spiders and little hermit crabs and tiny little things that nobody ever pays attention to that I love. But then they were like, oh, well, she's doing really well. Let's give her a bigger role. And then I started doing the live presenting. And then there was this pretty, you know, even now when I think about it, like nobody else will remember this except me. But I basically was perceived to have kicked him off the show. And I got a lot of heat on social media. It was probably the few times I actually ended up in the tabloids. I hated it, because I woke up one morning and all of a sudden, like, I had people calling me, oh my God, have you seen the papers? And I was like, what have I done? I don't know. So I really didn't like that. I was not prepared for it. I had no kind of support around me in terms of like, how do you manage this kind of 0 to 60 from, you know, kind of being totally invisible to all of a sudden being in the tabloids. And Twitter was a really nasty space for me. So that was my first kind of like, I guess, taking ownership and control of how social media affects me. And it was when it was still called Twitter, obviously. This is about 2018, 2017. And I decided that I didn't need to check something to see how much abuse I was getting every day. And I thought, like, why would I do that? And it really messed me up, but I just thought, I'm just going to delete it. And by that point, my Twitter account grew quite quickly. But when I deleted it, I deleted that with about, 50,000+, which is modest for most people. But, in the time that I'd been doing the work, it went really quickly. And I lost all those followers. And everyone was like, what have you done? Like, my agent was like, what have you done? And I just said, I don't know why I'd keep something that people can find me to send me abuse. So I'm just going to delete it. So it felt like a really radical thing to do. And it felt like maybe I'll not be able to, build this profile and stuff. But somehow it didn't destroy me. So I survived deleting my Twitter. So that was step one of disengaging with social media. And then the next sort of time when there was an issue with social media was Facebook. Now, is Facebook still called Facebook? Yeah. It is, okay. Well, you see what I mean? So I've got to rewind a little bit with what my issue with Facebook. Facebook wasn't about me. Facebook was about society for me. And in 2008, so my birth country, and the country I still very much consider home, I'm sort of home in both places, had a general election. And there was like this enormous amount of violence in a way that I think from people outside of like the African diaspora, it would seem like normal. Like people, I know because of the way the press covers stories, people are like, oh, well, that's just what they do in Africa. Because there was like all this violence and there were people killing each other on the streets, and it was just like mayhem. But for anyone who knows Kenya, it was a shock. And I couldn't understand what had gone wrong. And then roll on a few years, and then we had Trump and Brexit, I can't remember which way round. And by that point, a company called Cambridge Analytica started popping up in, like, not front page news, like tiny little news stories. But it was a company that had basically, Kirsty will probably be able to explain better than I can, but as far as I can understand it, they had experimented with how to influence the outcome of elections. And this is well documented. This is not a conspiracy theory, I promise. There have been court cases about it, so it's not libelous even to say what I'm saying. But it was found that Cambridge Analytica's first kind of lab was those 2008 elections in Kenya. And a lot of tech gets trialed in countries like Kenya, India, Kazakhstan, digital currencies there. So when we hear about things here for the first time, it's probably been trialed somewhere else in the world. So that was when I felt that Facebook, as a point of principle, I didn't want to engage with anymore. So I deleted that and lost contact with a lot of like high school friends, secondary school friends, family that I live around the world. And I just had to accept that I can't keep in touch with everyone. And I guess the people that matter will stay in touch. And we did. So I've got a tiny little friendship circle now, but anyway. And then Instagram, as you know, I said I disengaged with in 21 because I'd lost my father in 2018, and then there was a pandemic, and my mom wasn't doing too well by that point. And I found, for all those reasons I said earlier, I couldn't get it out of my head, even if my phone wasn't with me. I felt like I was having to do the work for, just like to be present and to be relevant and to all of those things. And I didn't, it wasn't making me feel good. So I disengaged I didn't delete my Instagram because I had that little it's the one last little connection I have. And if I decide to write a book or do a podcast or something, then I will need it. So I've kept it. But in the time, I've absolutely been able to operate my career without any engagement with social media at all. It's sometimes weird because, people expect you to know what they're up to and you don't know what they're up to. So it does feel like you're slightly in a parallel universe, but I feel like I've been able to reconnect to myself. I was going to say things like I've been more productive and da-da-da. That's not strictly true. But I feel like, so I wrote a few things down about the benefits. So I don't know, where everyone is with social media. I don't know what you use it for. And I think one of the things is there's this fear that, especially if you think you need it for your work, or if you need it. Like, there's some really great things about it. And I would love to see social media being more, and the platforms being more regulated, maybe not a great word, but maybe used more consciously by the people that design it, so we can use it for good, because it could be so good. It's like almost there, you know. But anyway, let me tell you what I think it is. So something that Kirsty mentioned about like following content that you like is definitely important. But I think in terms of someone who, like, if I have to stand in front of people and say something, it never feels good if I'm saying something that I don't really feel is coming from my heart and my soul. So one of the benefits of not being on social media for the last couple of years, in my view, for me, has been that it allows me to maintain a degree of independence about my opinions about things, the way I understand what's going on in the world, and particularly because of the job I do, which, you know, for the first time in the 30 years that I've done natural history and environmental programming, it's finally something that people want to hear about, which is like, really? Wow, okay. So as a result, it's easy to end up in an echo chamber, and then I just end up parroting what everyone else says. And it's not even that I don't know what I want to say, I'm influenced by influences, and therefore I'm not an independent thinker. So in a way, this is actually something that somebody told me just like 2 days ago on a meeting. And they said, well, you've just said things that only you can say, things that are uniquely you. So yes, I can talk about climate change, or I could talk about plastic pollution, or I could talk about elephant poaching. But what I say about that really should be uniquely me. It should be something that only I would say, think, and feel. As a result of all the experiences have led me into this place talking to all of you right now. And I found that with more and more engagement with social media, I was losing that sense of like being able to speak in a way that felt uniquely me and genuinely me and authentically me. So that's been one massive benefit of not being on social media, even though I'm someone who's supposed to have a public profile, is I now feel like when I open my mouth, the words are mine. And I can live and die by that, but at least, you know, I stand by it. This is what I believe. What else can I say about social media and not being? Okay, so talking about training your algorithms, I think it's funny that you say that, because I started doing something which is slightly weird. I think I confuse my algorithms now, because I started to deliberately follow content that was the opposite of what I think and the opposite of what I believe. So I started to follow content from climate deniers, for example. I started to follow content, and this is going to be really weird, right-wing content. And my algorithm now is quite like, most of the stuff I follow, I know I said I don't do social media. Most of what I do follow is YouTube, which is not algorithm free at all. But I don't comment, I don't like, so I try and limit my engagement in terms of how I feel like I'm engaging. I know it knows what I'm doing. And so as a result, I feel like when there's an event, a world event that everyone's preoccupied with, and sometimes rightly so, I will go and find the pros and the against. I will go and find the people that believe, so I try and get content from across the spectrum. I also try and find content that was produced, and I don't know why this year, Kirsty might be able to say why later, but content pre-2018 seems to have, has a different tone to it, and I would love to know why. But for example, when the Ukraine war broke out, I started to look at content pre-2018 to understand how we got to this place. And I found that it was less polarized. So when I read an article, it was less polarized than what we're used to seeing today. And there was less identity and politics that came into the narratives and stuff. So those are some of the things that I do if I have to use social media, which I do. That's what I do. But ultimately, I think for me, social media, no matter whether you need it for your work or whether you do it for entertainment, the way I see it is that it's somehow like flipped the paradigm, because pre-social media, pre-internet, if someone wanted to sell me something, they had to go and do the work. They had to go and find the advertising agency and the production companies and make the adverts and think about how to tell the story, and they'd have to work. And I didn't have to do that job. And I think what's happened with social media is that we are all doing the work for them. Because ultimately the only reason why social media exists in the way that it does at the moment is to sell stuff. Sometimes it's selling my stuff, my podcast, my book, whatever. But ultimately it's eyeballs on screens so that you're doing the work to sell someone else's product. And I'm not sure that's right. So so I guess we're out of time. So that's my survivor story. I quit social media and survived until last night. Thank you for listening. And I hope that was helpful. And not quite what I was expecting to say, but there you go.